So if we are to meet learning needs, if we are to meet cultural needs, if we are to teach the child in front of us, um, there's no one right way. There's no one recipe book that teaches us exactly how to do this. That would make our lives a lot easier, perhaps, but also a lot more boring. I think, music happens in the messy parts. It happens in the bits that we can't quite figure out yet as teachers or as learners.
Welcome to Leading Notes, where I talk with musicians who are leading the revitalisation of social health in our communities. I'm your host, Melissa Forbes. Alexis Kallio is an interdisciplinary researcher who explores how music education and creative practices create opportunities for equity and justice, particularly for young people experiencing vulnerability or marginalisation. Drawing on her expertise in music education and criminology, Alexis examines how educators and musicians navigate questions of power, values, and meaning in their work. Her research bridges grassroots community practice with institutional frameworks, asking critical questions about how we can structure creative spaces to support positive youth development. Alexis has taught across studio, school, university, and community settings in both Australia and Finland. Her teaching puts equity and justice at the centre, exploring how communities can learn, create, and engage together in ways that honour everyone's potential. Alexis Kallio, welcome to Leading Notes.
Thank you, Melissa. It's lovely to be here.
Alexis, you've been working extensively on music programs in youth justice settings. Can you tell me a little bit about what drew you to this kind of work?
Sure. Let's see. Well, before I began my PhD, I was a secondary school music teacher. So working with and supporting young people has really been at the core of who I am and what I do with music. And that took me overseas to Finland to do my PhD. But when I came back, it was really an opportunity for me to think about the contribution that I could make and where I could use my skills in a productive way where they'd be needed. And while I've always done a lot of theoretical work in this space, it's also always been really important for me to ground that in practice. So when I was moving back to Australia, I was reading quite a lot on the state of youth justice, and in honesty, it made me really angry. And it made me realize that this is a context that is in urgent need of research, but also theorizing to really understand the potential of music in these spaces, and to advocate for children's rights in these spaces. I thought that was a space that I could really contribute. I hold degrees in both music education, but a prior one in criminology as well. So I bring quite a unique kind of combination of perspectives, I think. I thought I'd be well placed to do that work.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because it sounds like you've given quite a lot of consideration to your personal values, but also, your prior experience outside of music. And those things have really coalesced to lead you to kind of specialise in this particular area. And that's something that I really try to encourage my students to do as well, to consciously reflect on what's important to you and let that drive what you're doing.
Yes, however, I don't think it's always been particularly conscious. I think I've always been values driven in how I work and learn and what I'm interested in doing. But I finished that criminology degree thinking, well, that was kind of a waste of 3 years. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. And here I am. Just the jobs that I could see on the horizon after that degree were not ones that fit me. But I've kind of created my own space in a different field, but definitely referring back to some of that work and continuing the learning definitely from that work. But what I could see at the time, just it wasn't me. So it took some time to bring them together, I guess.
Yeah, and it takes time, I think, for some of us to find our place in music, and it's not always the obvious places.
And I think that there's more than one.
Yeah, indeed.
So I've found my place at different times in different spaces and with different people. But I think that those values that you mentioned, that's been the consistent part of the puzzle, I think.
So you talked about the different spaces that you work in. If you're working in a youth detention centre, are the pedagogical approaches the same, different, adapted, depending on who you're working with? What connection do they have with, say, your teaching in a school setting? Is it a different approach altogether?
It sounds like an easy question, but it's not. All of the above. So at the end of the day, these are children. And there's a lot of information, I suppose, that we can glean about children who do find themselves in these settings, but they're not always the most useful information in terms of reaching them through music. And it's also information that we don't necessarily have about our students in a school classroom, even though their experiences might be somewhat similar. So I think what stands out for me is really centering young people's own agency, so their own sense of being able to make decisions and to act and to feel that sense of ownership over and through their music, centering young people's culture and identity, and also centering their lived experience. But I'm not sure that I would answer differently for children in a school classroom. You're working within different parameters, but I think knowing who your students are is really important as a music teacher or music facilitator. So in terms of pedagogies, I think some of it is amplified. And I'm not sure it's in sort of set methods such as Kodai or Orff, though all of those have, really useful elements in them. But I'm thinking student-led music making is often really successful. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're writing their own raps or making beats. It can mean that they're sharing music that's important to them, and learning how to play an element of that. I think that a strengths-based approach is really important. So working with what they can do rather than working with where we need to make up the gaps or the sort of ground we need to cover. And also, of course, there's the importance of a sort of trauma-aware approach. But I think that is, we're also increasingly recognizing how important that is for the classroom. So trauma doesn't necessarily refer to a specific kind of experience. If some of the experiences of these children who do find themselves incarcerated are, really quite horrific, and, just compounded disadvantage and struggles. But trauma is really how things impact on people and the meanings that they ascribe to experiences, but also new things that come into their lives. And that can be from something small equally as it can be from something, really devastating and significant from an outside perspective. So I think that trauma-aware approach is relevant for anybody working with young people, no matter who those young people are.
Yeah, of course, I completely agree with you, but I do wonder about how well that's been done in the past in traditional music education. I think we're obviously a lot more aware of these things now, but, a lot of musicians of a certain age, and yes, I'm grey-haired and in my 50s, talk about having kind of been traumatized by some of their educational experiences, it being the thing that traumatizes people. So I think we're making a lot of progress, but we still have a ways to go.
Absolutely. I think there's a real danger in when we think about teaching methods or pedagogical approaches as something that's fixed.
Yeah.
That this is the right way to do something. There is no one right way because there's no one child. So if we are to meet learning needs, if we are to meet cultural needs, if we are to teach the child in front of us, there's no one right way. There's no one recipe book that teaches us exactly how to do this. That would make our lives a lot easier, perhaps, but also a lot more boring. I think, music happens in the messy parts. It happens in the bits that we can't quite figure out yet as teachers or as learners. And I think that, that's why we really need that close connection between practice and research and theory. So practice is, we don't have research without practice, otherwise what would we be researching? But theory helps us to really make sense of, well, what's really going on here? And then complete that loop. Like, if this is really what's going on, how then do I respond as an educator or facilitator to be able to really fulfill those aims, no matter what they are, of myself as teacher, as the student or young person I'm working with, or the institution, and what's the point of all of this? So I think that they're all really closely connected, and there's no right answer in that again. So this idea of fixing what we should be doing or who we should all become through music is kind of absurd.
Yeah. And I think, dealing with the messiness of addressing the individual who's in front of you calls upon the educator to be creative, right? And to improvise and have like a big bag of tricks that they can draw upon to respond to the situation and to respond to context. And, as an educator, I find that actually really exhilarating. That's when I feel like I'm really doing my job here, because, I'm figuring it out as I go. I'm not obviously flying blind at all, but I've got all of the experience to go, okay, what do you need and how can I meet that need? And that's a creative act, I think.
Absolutely. And it's also the life of a perpetual student, which is just glorious, I think. That's why we're working in universities, right? But I think there's a real danger in thinking also that you have to be the expert all the time as a teacher. Actually, I think you should rarely be the expert. It's always, I learn so much more from my teaching than I ever did from being taught. And I hope that doesn't end when I feel like I'm an expert in something. Maybe it's time to, close that chapter, find something else. But I think that's just an inherent part of seeing teaching and seeing music as a relational undertaking.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of that relationality and creative educators, you've been collaborating with Western Australian hip-hop artist Optimus, aka Scott Griffiths, working on a program in youth detention and community centres. You've spoken to me about his effectiveness, and I'd love to hear what makes him effective in your view, and what can we take away from someone like Scott and the way that he works in these contexts?
Sure, I've learned so much from Scott and his team, and I'm continuing to learn so many things. I think firstly is that he isn't working alone. He's part of a really skilled and experienced team with various expertise from social work to teaching to some psychology. But the core of all of their work is music. They can bring all kinds of different skill sets, but what they all share in common is that they are pretty amazing musicians. And I really think that challenges the idea we have so often in teaching that, if you don't quite make it as a performer, well, then you teach. And then you quickly get into teaching and realize, oof, this is much more than I bargained for with that rhetoric going on around me, So I think that musical expertise is really central to what they do. And that positions them very differently to the young people than a traditional teacher-student kind of hierarchy. And I think it's really important, or actually my research has shown that it's really important to the young people that they're not working with these musicians as teachers. So they are more experienced musicians, but they both meet as musicians. So there is still a hierarchy. There are still power relations at play. Of course there are. It's still a child-adult relationship. But when these young people have often had such disrupted and negative experiences of schooling, to then be put and sitting in front of another teacher can be a really confronting and uncomfortable experience that they will just shut down, because nothing about teachers has ever been good. They've been told you don't learn well, you have learning difficulties, you're disruptive, you don't belong. Like, whether explicitly or implicitly, this is a lot of what they hear. So then to meet another adult in a different kind of setting is a way to really relearn how to have those relationships with someone in a position of, relative power. So I think that meeting between musicians is really important that they do. I think so that the one of the main programs that they run is one called Banksia Beats, which is run out of the Banksia Hill Youth Detention Centre, just outside of Perth. And I think what's really interesting about that space is that the young people really have a sense of ownership over it, to the extent that they painted the walls. There's this sort of artistic graffiti around the outside. They put in the soundproofing. It's their space. And in a space where young people have ownership over literally nothing, they can't, often in prisons and youth detention centres, you can't even choose the temperature of your shower. And then to have ownership over something with expensive music equipment, and have that as yours, can be really a sense of pride and that somebody trusts you because they are being trusted. And that can make a really big difference in how young people see themselves and each other. And that extends to the music as well, to have that ownership over the music that they're writing and recording and producing, whether that means that they are the one at the mic, or whether it means that they're holding the notebook for somebody else, or if it just means sitting in the room, feeling that sense of belonging and that it's theirs, I think is a really powerful part of the many things that they learn through music, but also just being and becoming themselves through music as well. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. So you and I both teach, up and coming musicians. If you came across a student who was really interested in the type of work that you do and was thinking about how they might go about working in that kind of context, say youth detention centre, what skills or mindsets do they need to cultivate, do you think, to step into that space?
Well, I do have students who are working in these spaces that I'm learning from. I think there is an open-mindedness, because these are particularly odd spaces, but so are schools.
It's all a bit weird when you think about it.
It's all a bit like when and so is a youth centre, and so is a care home for elderly. Like, they're all kind of funny institutions that you need to navigate certain norms, certain rules. But none of the musicians that I've ever worked with have known anything about the offending histories of the young people that they're working with, and they don't care. And while you might think that, well, how can I be trauma informed or trauma aware without being aware of the trauma? Or, how can I respond to needs if I don't know what their needs? Well, they will tell you. But we need to learn how to listen. And we're not listening for offending histories or events in your life or things like this that we can ascribe our own meanings to. But rather just, keeping your mouth shut, a little, like, getting out of the way, and letting young people take their time and explore and learn, when to lean in a little bit and, assist or support or listen and respond, but also learning when to lean out when you need to think through things on your own and thinking, well, what's going on here and how do I need to navigate this to do it ethically and responsibly, and what's my role? I think, so that's open-mindedness. I think there's also a need to have fun. Music is complex and it's many different things, but it's also a space for expression and connection and joy, and that's no different no matter where you are. And I think that's another thing that's really important for all children, but maybe especially these children, is that there's not a whole lot of room to be creative and have fun and play.
Yeah.
In a detention center.
Yeah.
So music can be a really important space and medium for that. So I don't think it always needs to be, super serious and, going through all these really difficult themes and topics in order to be a responsible educator. It's also just having a good time with music. And that can be more powerful than we can possibly imagine. So I think having that sort of playful, joyful outlook, regardless of where you are. And I think a lot of people have also described to me, it doesn't take long to forget where you are. Because again, you're working with children. They are still just children.
Yeah.
And they've got their musical likes and dislikes, and, there'll be a bicker over like, I don't want to play that song. And, it's the same things that you've heard with teenagers somewhere else. And, you kind of just get on with it. So I think also, in a way, just getting on with it and responding to who's in the room, and having those really authentic connections with other people. Rather than always framing it in terms of, oh my goodness, why are you here? What's led to this? All these, that's still there. That's not going to go away, but not letting that be the focus, but rather, letting the child and the music be the focus, I think is important.
Yeah. I was going to ask you whether there's any kind of particular strategies that are most effective, but I think you've already told me that by saying that really you respond to the person in front of you. And the way that you were talking about open-mindedness and that approach, all the things that you described there about, working with these youth in detention, you were describing what musicians learn how to do.
Yeah.
The parallels are quite striking, I think.
Absolutely. I think it's intensified.
Yeah.
Because it is a peculiar kind of setting, and there aren't many opportunities for young people to be creative and exercise agency and all these kinds of things outside of it. But I don't think it's wildly different. I think it's just maybe more visible.
Yeah. And do you think that musicians and artists are kind of uniquely placed in a way
Absolutely.
because of their skills and the training that they've developed to work in this way?
In general, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think music is a really interesting medium in these spaces. Because this is something that I get asked quite a lot, like, why music? Why not sport? And why not visual arts? And why not, Shakespeare? Or, why music? And, not taking anything away from the other arts or sport or, any other opportunities that these young people or any young people might have. I think that music is quite unique in that it is at once this very individual means of self-expression, and it's whether you're creating music to put out or whether you're listening to music that you like and sort of curating your playlists, or any of those kinds of activities. It's like Tia Denora describes as the technology of the self. It's something that reflects who we are but makes who we are, and how we act and assign meaning in the world. But it's also a very, very social activity at exactly the same time. Yeah. So we can't listen to music without there being a musician, without there being a recording with a producer without there being a whole genre history and cultural history around whatever we're listening to. So even if we're doing it on our own, it's always together with others. And then when we are creating music together with others, it demands even more kind of relational skills in terms of we have to learn to listen, we have to negotiate, we have to learn how to take critique, we learn how to give feedback. We learn how to make all of those creative decisions, which translate into all kinds of decisions we make with other people. That, you can't just be, wonderfully blindly selfish and do what you want. It is a sort of collaboration, and that's quite a demanding task for many people, or for everybody. So that simultaneous demand and opportunity, I guess, to connect with the individual, but also connect with the social, I think makes it quite a unique undertaking. And I think musicians often don't recognize what we're doing.
Yeah.
And also, sometimes I think that we are quite bad listeners, surprisingly, perhaps, given how much we have to listen. And I think that Dylan Robinson has a book called Hungry Listening, which just writes about this beautifully. He doesn't say that we're bad listeners, but he says we do listen in particular ways. And he describes it as hungry listening, sort of this listening for. So for things we already know we're on the lookout for. And this, I think, connects with that idea of open-mindedness. And he makes this distinction between listening for, of whether it's listening for the cadence, listening for, something that's coming up, listening for some kind of meaning that we already know is coming up, versus listening to, of this much more open, much more learning alongside others, much more, just listening to see what comes and learning what that might be. And I think that sometimes as musicians, particularly those of us who've, but not exclusively, grown up within an art music tradition, we've been taught to listen according to such normative parameters and rules, I suppose, that to learn that, let them go. It's just listen. And don't have that expectation I know what's coming up. Because with young people, you definitely don't know what's coming up. But, it's a challenging thing to learn how to listen differently as a musician as well. But we all have been through that process of learning to listen. So it's just about remembering that skill of learning rather than that skill that we've already perfected or think we have.
Yeah, and I've heard our brains described as prediction machines. That's how we're kind of hardwired, is to listen or to predict anything in terms of our sensory awareness. And so it's almost like you have to consciously work to, operate on a different cognitive plane, if you like. And I'd love to learn more about the listening to, and that book sounds fascinating because
it's a beautifully written book as well.
Yeah,
it's a nice one. I think it's something like the security and comfort that we're always seeking as people. But I think, if we're going back to that idea of mindsets, I think it's also a willingness to experience discomfort, to not know the answers, and to hold space for multiple perspectives and experiences and identities without needing to be right, or without needing to understand exactly what all of them are and mean. And that's a really challenging task, actually.
Yeah. You recently hosted a national symposium on music, crime and social change. What were the key insights that that came out of that symposium? And is it shaping what you're going to do next, or where's that all at?
That was such a wonderful event. We had really interesting speakers and attendees, which interestingly, it wasn't particularly deliberate, but there was a really even representation from academia and then from musicians working in these kinds of spaces. We had a few from advocacy organizations and also sort of industry representatives. So it was a real mix of people. and a lovely mix of people who were all very enthusiastic and excited to be there, me included. And I think the theme of the event was that everybody had felt like that they were doing a lot of work in isolation. So everybody, I mean, it was such a sort of joyful event because everybody had kind of found their people, and had felt no matter in which domain they were working, but felt like, I'm kind of doing this on my own, and I'm working really hard to learn how to do it, but it's tough, and I don't have a sounding board, and I don't have people who can say, oh, I tried that, it didn't work, or I know how you feel. And bringing together these people, even though they were from sort of various different disciplines and various different industries and experiences, there was something in common that people were, I guess, relieved and inspired to kind of find each other. So something that's already sort of come out of that is sort of hosting some regular get-togethers for the people that were there, and as that snowballs into other people as well, and that's through a bigger research project that I'm working on at the moment, together with some scholars from the University of Sydney, called Policing Australian Popular Music. It's a multi-year project, but we sort of extended that discussion beyond policing, thinking that policing, yes, it means the police force, but there's also sort of policing actions and mechanisms that we do in all kinds of industries and institutions and areas of society. So this is very much part of that. But it's been a really nice space for people to come and share and learn and connect. So I think that's one of the difficulties, I think, about working in spaces like youth detention, is that there's not an industry body, there's not a qualification, there's not a network. A lot of folks are either working on their own or working through NGOs or similar kind of providers, and it can be quite isolating. So I think finding ways to meet other people or bring other people together is really important for all of us to learn how to do this better, which is really the goal for whatever we're doing in life. I think we should always be looking to improve and figure out new ways to meet the needs of young people and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah, and presumably if there's lots of disparate activity happening across the country, it's much harder to get the ear of policymakers, if you don't have some kind of peak representation to show that there's a critical mass behind this work. Tell me about the submission that you made to the recent inquiry around youth justice and incarceration, and how do you think, if we can get some more kind of I hate this phrase, but joined up activity in your space, do you think that's going to help move the dial there?
I think, ultimately the main point is that we shouldn't be putting children in detention centres. We have decades of research that say that, any involvement with law enforcement makes youth offending more frequent and more severe. So the idea that we are incarcerating children and incarcerating them for longer is counterproductive to this idea of making communities safer. And this is actually one of the challenges that I have with music and my work as well, is I don't necessarily want to make youth detention centres more palatable places to put children. And neither am I there to save anybody. That is not my place. But there is a need. There is a need from these children to have a more child-centered system, as imperfect and seriously imperfect as it is. But I think there's also a lot of work to be done before we let young people get to that stage of even going anywhere near a courthouse. In terms of access to music, in terms of access to communities and youth workers, and all those supports that they may not have through, compounded disadvantage of poverty, of addiction, of, intergenerational traumas, of, any of these kinds of pathways that we know contribute to children who end up being faced with these kinds of situations, and realize that it is not a system of punishment. It's a system that really does need to be focused on child rights and child needs, and that'll vastly reduce our problems. And I think music has a definite place to play in that work as well. I think it's probably even more important. But where we are right now in Australia, I think, is really quite scary. So anything that I can do in that space that advocates for young people's voices, which sometimes is articulated more clearly through their music than through any words that they'll say to a social worker or a psychologist. So, there's work to be done on all fronts, I suppose.
Yeah. And you've received funding from the Australian Research Council to continue this exciting work, and you're working with the Queensland Police Service, I believe.
I am. So this is our Policing Australian Popular Music project between Griffith University and the University of Sydney, together with Murray Lee, Giorgi Ravulo and Toby Martin. And we're looking at policing and popular music from all kinds of perspective. And now it's kind of extending a bit beyond popular music. What is popular anyway? But it's really interesting. So my work with the Queensland Police is almost looking at the other side of this, of what music programs are police involved in to improve relations with young people, to support young people before, we get to the stage of policing in its more traditional terms. And a lot of these young people, I think sometimes quite rightly, have a really tense relationship even with the idea of police. So how are they engaging with music to change that narrative on behalf of the police force, but also in the minds of young people, and open up that space for a more open-minded, productive way to understand each other, I suppose. And it's been really interesting from the beginning of this, of hearing, we don't really have any music programs, to now being contacted by a number of police force workers, but also other organizations that work alongside or together with police, saying, we've got this project, we've heard you're up to this, can we please be involved? So it's kind of taken on a life of its own, but I'm just in the beginning of starting to map where this is happening, and then doing some more in-depth research as to what folks are up to and what they're achieving in these spaces.
Thinking back over the way that you've shaped your space within music, Alexis, it's unique. What's the most important lesson about human connection that music has taught you?
That music is all about connection, and connection is all about music. And I think that's actually beyond human connection as well. If we're thinking, there's music and that inherently has connection to place, to history, to nature. And I think that music's woven in between all of it. And I don't think that you can have music without those connections either, which is fascinating to me. So I think it's all part of this kind of really complex tapestry of what it means to live together, but also become together. Because as I said, I think right at the beginning, that we have these ideas of things being fixed, whether it's music methods or identities or cultures, and they never are. And part of the way that we represent what we are, but also how we create where we're going and who we're becoming, is with music. And that's always in relation to others. And I just love how complex and messy that is.
Me too. So if you had to choose one song to bring a group of strangers together, what would you pick and why?
I love this question. And I wouldn't pick a song I know. Again, because I would like to know who's in the room. So I think it would be, and if we're really coming together, I think it would be something that we write together, which might be any genre, it might be any instruments, it might be any language. I don't know. But I've always found it difficult to write lesson plans or syllabi or, repertoire lists or anything like that, but without knowing who I'm working with. So, and who I'm learning with. So I think that would be something that we'd do together and make its own weird musical becoming of whatever it might become. I don't know. But I think that that's a wonderful way to get a group of people to know a little, actually quite a lot sometimes, about each other too. It's not necessarily easy, but geez, is it fun.
What would you want to achieve with one wave of your magic wand?
With one wave of magic wand, I think I would have music and music education broadly conceived. So not only school music, but I'd like music and music education to be a right for every child, regardless of their background or circumstance, and something that is seen as essential to their lives now, but also their growth, and as a sort of inherently valuable part of who they are and will be for the rest of their lives, rather than conceiving of music as a luxury or a reward or optional extra. I think recognizing that it's a very central part of being human and that we should all have a right to that. I think that would be my magic wish.
Alexis Kallio, thank you for making music that matters and for being my guest today on Leading Notes.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. It's been fun.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and make sure to leave a review. I acknowledge that this podcast is produced on the lands of the Gayabal and Jarowair peoples of the Toowoomba region, and I pay my respect to all elders. Mark Schultes produced the original music for this podcast. Thanks for listening. Now go make music that matters.